Budget Committee members could please come to the budget room. We're going to begin this meeting in about approximately 5 minutes. If everyone could please come to the committee room, we're going to begin in about 5 minutes. We're going to start in 1 minute, so anyone who's not here, please make their way to the Budget Committee. Thank you. 1 minute. Meeting of the Budget Committee will now come to order. Welcome back, everyone, to the third hearing of the California Forward proposal. So far, we've had two hearings that have been quite illuminating and have had some really good discussion. We've talked about performance-based budgeting, program evaluation, budget information provided by the governor, the vote threshold issue, non-recurring revenues. What we've covered so far. Today we're going to cover the topics of pay-as-you-go, the budget timetable, and expanding the governor's mid-year powers. I expect that we're going to have another spirited and interesting discussion today. Next, this is our final meeting in terms of issue discussion, direct on the California Forward proposal. Next week, we're going to focus on the sponsor amendments that California Forward is going to give us based on our discussions. So that'll be the focus next week. And they're in part really the things that have come up in our discussion. So that is a moving target. So today's discussion is pretty critical as far as that goes. And I guess the other piece I want to remind everyone, and I've said this at each hearing, is that the proposal before us is not perfect. And there are parts of it that I like, and there are parts of it that I really don't like. But what's really interesting is that looking at it as a package, as a whole proposal. And so we need to vet every aspect of it, but we also need to keep in mind that politics is the art of compromise. So with that, before we move forward, I want to ask Mr. Nielsen if he wants to have any opening comments. No? Okay, then what we'll do again, we've experimented with going through each issue or doing all issues as a clump. I think it worked out well last time when we took the three issues in as one. So I will ask Mr. Fuhr to take up the package of three issues that we're considering today, and all the panelists, and we'll go through the entirety, and then we'll have members' question and discussion. So, Mr. Fuhr.
Thank you, Mary. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. It's great to be back in this committee. These have been extremely important discussions, and a moment, as I've said throughout the course of these deliberations, when the people we represent are really demanding of us that we break from the status quo and help lead the effort to reform state government. Today we have three specific categories of issue before us, and I'll address them briefly in turn. We have another distinguished panel of experts from California Forward, and then I know the chair will lead a discussion. The first of the elements to be discussed today is what is called the pay-as-you-go provision, or the provisions that are embedded in these proposals. There are really two basic ideas. The first is that if one is proposing through either a piece of legislation or a constitutional amendment here in this building, a proposal for a new program that costs $25 million or more, that program needs to be accompanied with how it's going to be paid for. New program, more than $25 million, how are you going to pay for it? That includes not only a program that might provide an array of new services, it also pertains to a tax cut. The other element in the pay-as-you-go proposal is an element that says, with regard to citizen initiatives, that if those initiatives are proposing a new or expanded program, that they too need to be accompanied with their funding source. The latter of which is contained in a bill by our colleague Senator Ducheney, as well as in this package. The next set of proposals pertains to the timing of budgets and the consequences of the untimely enactment of budgets. It says very basically that budget and trailer bills have to be put in place by June 25th by this legislature. And every day that we do not get a budget on time is a day when we will sacrifice our pay until we do. Then there is a set of changes proposed regarding gubernatorial powers. They permit the governor, in the event that there is a declaration of fiscal emergency, and in the event that this legislature fails to act on that emergency within 45 days, the governor is then enabled to reduce Budget Act appropriations. I will note, as I've said in previous hearings about this element, this legislature historically has acted in a timely way when a fiscal emergency has been declared. And if we do not act in a timely way in the event of a fiscal emergency, then I think it's hard to argue for why this legislature should exist at all. We can succeed in addressing such an emergency, but there are consequences on this proposal if we don't. It also permits the the legislature to override those gubernatorial reductions in Spending Act appropriations on a 2/3 vote. And finally, this proposal also says that the act to address a fiscal emergency, if accompanied by a statement that it does so, suffices for the purpose of this provision. So, 3 somewhat related provisions today. Pay as you go for new legislation or for a new initiative. Timely preparation and enactment of budgets by our House, our body, our legislature, accompanied with consequences for individual legislators if we don't. And new gubernatorial powers in mid-year in the event of a fiscal emergency. With that, Mr. Chair, I'd like to quickly refer to the experts from California Forward who are here with me this afternoon, and then another vigorous discussion I'm sure will ensue. If I might, Mr. Chair, our first expert, please. Just please introduce yourselves and move forward.
Thank you. My name is Bruce McPherson, former Secretary of State, Senator, and Assembly member, and it's nice to be back again, and thank you for having me. Even if I didn't know that this was going to be the 3rd time, but it's nice to be back to address you, and I appreciate your serious discussion on this and the questions that you've had. We've thanked them. We've needed those, and we're open to suggestions as we go along. On the lawmakers forfeiting pay, the measure before you, as was mentioned, would require that if a budget bill is not passed and presented to the governor by June 25th, the members of the legislature would forfeit their pay and living expenses. And much can be said about that reform. Some say it's too harsh, it goes too far, and it punishes all legislators for the actions possibly of just a few. And they could be right. But we think that there's some necessity in getting a timely budget. At the end of the day, we need this reform because the timely budget is very, very important to keep government going, and especially for the local governments that have grown increasingly dependent on state financial decisions. Passing a budget in August as opposed to June should have a consequence, or even the following February for that matter. But if we get a budget that's passed prior to the January 1st fiscal year, it will result in a better and more fair budgetary process and decisions from the state government on down to the local governments. We really notice this when we're seeing that teachers get their layoff notices in mid-March, and really the school districts unfairly don't really have a clue of what is coming down from the state. On pay-as-you-go, the general public is really craving for some budgetary reforms. At California Forward, we looked across the country for reforms that made sense and best practices in other states. The pay-as-you-go principle is one that simply changes in policy that increased costs must identify how they will be paid for, either with new revenue or reductions elsewhere, such as a new tax credit. This provision is not intended to be a spending cap, so it doesn't apply to every additional dime that gets spent. It is meant to discipline those policy choices that, if not financed, will contribute to the structural budget deficits. It is a focused reform on a specific reform, but it's a problem that must be solved. We literally can't go into the next recession, and I think and I hope that you would agree with that, with a budget that is already in the red. On the executive powers during fiscal emergencies, to the public, it feels like we've been in a constant fiscal emergency for years, and indeed we have in the state. And as you well know, that's why our package of reforms, some of you do know, proposes a new fiscal emergency provisions, allowing the governor to make spending reductions if no action is taken by the legislature in a declared fiscal emergency. As was stated, that hasn't been a big problem in the state, but we think it's one that needs to be included in this reform package. We do believe that this reform package is a specific one that addresses a specific problem. It does not fundamentally shift the power from one branch of government to another, but it does make sure that in an emergency a decision will get made. I appreciate you're allowing me to speak to you again on this, and I do appreciate the attention that you have given to it, because I think we would all agree that something needs to be done to improve the budget process in the state of California. Thank you.
Thank you. Next.
Good afternoon. I'm Sunny McPeak, a member of the Leadership Council of California Forward. I've served in the public sector and local government, and also have worked for the state, and for 3 decades have had the opportunity to testify before the legislature on budget reform. And I do want to thank you, Mr. Chairman and Mr. Vice Chairman, and members of the committee for so systematically looking at the issues of reform with such bipartisan leadership here. I've been testifying so long, I decided this afternoon, that is, for so many decades, I'm going to start a new caucus of California Forward called Grandmothers for Budget Reform. And I think and hope that maybe we can, together, you can craft a bipartisan package through all this examination. I'm going to focus in on pay-as-you-go today, but for the last couple of years, usually I'm testifying on results-based government. I mean, how to set performance outcomes, how to budget and manage to them, and pay-as-you-go is a really important companion to that discipline. It is introducing additional transparency. As our author, Assemblyman Farrer, has explained, the proposal is what the federal government used in the 1990s to balance the budget, what other states, such as Minnesota, have adopted, that if a new program, be it either expenditure or tax cut, is going to be enacted, then the legislature and the administration have to identify the revenue to cover that. It is a huge help if you've got performance-based outcomes to be able to look at, is an existing program more important and more cost-effective than what's being proposed, and by having a pay-as-you-go or pay-go provision, then we guard against uncertainties or spikes in costs that don't get matched with revenue. That's another important part of the discipline, to also not have increases in revenue used for ongoing expenditures if those one-time revenues cannot be demonstrated to have the ongoing revenue stream to support a proposal. I'll close by saying that overall, we have at California Forward advanced a bipartisan package, and it is indeed a package of proposals that we think together provide important budget tools and discipline. However, it's really probably beyond the mechanics of budgeting that we speak. It is to how do we have fiscal stability, budget reform that produces fiscal stability that will attract capital investment to our state and generate jobs. So it's providing a foundation for economic recovery and prosperity that we come here today to advance. And I'm going to turn this over to Don Saylor, who is the Mayor Pro Tem of Davis, to talk about the local government perspective.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members. My name is Don Saylor. I'm Mayor Pro Tem of the City of Davis. I've been a member of that council since 2004. I served as a school board member in Davis from 95 to 2003, and I'm currently running unopposed for a Yolo County Supervisor seat. This room was the location of many formative experiences for me. I started work in California as a member of the Legislative Analyst Office from 1979 to 84. A few years ago, it became so clear to us in local government that we were facing a serious crisis in governance at the state and local level between our two levels of government. As a result of that, many of us in the Davis and Yolo County area formed a group called Saving California Communities, and that's a grandiose title, but we believe that that is exactly what we need to be doing, that this crisis is tearing apart the fabric and vitality of our communities throughout the state in every form of economics and government that we can imagine. I appear to you today as someone from local government, which partners with the state to provide essential services, and as an elected official who tries to be responsive to everyone in the community that I serve and to continue to earn their trust. I'm also one of the many people around the state who's participated in the California Forward processes through the various work groups and interactive tools that they've used to devise the elements of the program changes that they're recommending. I'm focused today on pay-as-you-go provision. This provision may bother some because it seems to exert too much fiscal discipline. It may bother others because it doesn't do enough. But from my perspective and that perspective of many I work with, this provision strikes the right balance. It simply requires policy choices with fiscal impacts to be financed when they come forward. In particular, I support the balanced approach that pay-as-you-go carries with it because it applies to both program cost increases and to revenue reductions or tax expenditures. And I appreciate that it's envisioned as applying not just to the actions of the legislature, but also to the actions of the voters in bringing measures to the ballot. If the state's revenue system was not so volatile as it is, this might not be necessary. If the state truly had to balance every budget, this might not be necessary. But given the natural tendency that's exerted itself over the years, in good times we have added, and in bad times the challenges are even bigger. And we all know that some parts of the budget are easier to cut than others, and when we don't finance policy choices, that's new programs or revenue cuts, at the time we make those policy choices, we really are just leaving it for others to make the real trade-off at some point in the future. And from my experience, that means that the most vulnerable Californians are the first hurt, and that hurts our local communities. We in local government literally share the burden of serving as public officials during these tough times, but we're committed to working together both regionally and at a state level, regardless of party affiliation, to get the job done. We make tough decisions, and we all need to work together to fix what isn't working. These budget proposals are good for California's communities and for local government. They create stability for all of us sitting in city halls and county seats. Pay-as-you-go is a focus on the long term and on accountability for results. And I am pleased to see the bipartisan participation in this hearing and urge your support for pay-as-you-go. Californians support their households with the resources that they have, and we expect our government to do the same. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Be delighted to take questions from the committee.
Okay, before we do that, we have a quorum, and I'd like to get that out of the way. Clerk, if you could read the...
Blumenfield.
Here.
Nielsen. Here. Adams. Here. Arambula. Bell. Berryhill. Here. Brownlee. Buchanan. Here. Caballero. Carter. Here. Chesbro. Cook. De la Torre. Emerson. Evans. Fuhr.
Here.
Fuller. Here. Furtani. Gilmore. Here. Harkey. Here. Huffman. Jeffries. Here. Jones. Nastandi. Ruskin.
Here.
Silva. Here. Swanson.
Present.
Okay, I'll start with a couple of quick questions, and I'll move to member questions. You mentioned if we had a balanced budget requirement, we wouldn't need to do this, is one thing I heard. But don't we have a balanced budget requirement, and why isn't that working?
Well, I don't think I said it. Yes, I do think we have a balanced budget requirement, but we don't seem to end up there with a balanced budget after it's adopted. This is an additional discipline that would examine very closely the costs of a new program. Now, this applies not to the budget bill. So remember, we have a package of reforms that end up with budget reform and fiscal discipline overall. But it is my understanding there is a requirement of a balanced budget in California. We all know how we back into printing money in the state. You overestimate revenues and underestimate costs. And what this adds is mid-year or during the discussions of new programs that ultimately have to be accounted for in a budget, you look at, is there the money? Where will the money come from? And if there is not a growing budget, revenue stream, if you will, then what can be cut in order to give higher priority to what's being proposed? That's the discipline that is added.
And I think I mentioned something about that if the state truly had to balance every budget. Now, there is a budget that is balanced on paper, but as Ms. McPeak has just mentioned, within weeks of the last several budgets being adopted, major flaws have been revealed, relying on revenues from the federal government that are not really coming is one example. But you all know those examples much better than we do. Simply in the environment where accounting tricks or phantom revenues have been used in balancing the budget, it's even more important that pay-as-you-go provisions be incorporated as a part of the fiscal discipline of the legislature and the people.
Yeah. I guess one concern I have about the way, currently it's the members who sort of decide whether something is going to pay for itself. Under this PAYGO provision, we're sort of delegating some of that responsibility to unelected staff members who are going to determine whether or not something is truly going to cost money in the future, whether that be a tax sales credit that may, in fact, create revenue in the future, or whether that be a program that we believe is going to create revenue in the future. How would you respond to that concern that we're shifting that responsibility?
Fred Silva with the California Forward. I think there are two issues here. One of them, I'd like to separate the budget discussion, which obviously has to be balanced when you pass it, and the future commitments you make through legislation, whether they are tax measures or they're legislation that enact long-term commitments for state dollars. And part of what we're suggesting is that there be an analysis that's done in the legislative body, both by the fiscal committees and by the legislative analysts, to the extent that one of those bills, which either reduces tax liability and therefore reduces revenue to the state, or has a new entitlement that makes a future commitment, that be analyzed and considered and understood with respect to the future commitment that it makes. We've suggested to enforce that, there's a provision that would go in the Constitution that to the extent that that piece of legislation, either a new program or a reduction in taxes, did not affect the state's balance in the future, that measure is simply void. And so the governor, that you would not pass a bill that was void, nor would the governor sign a bill that was void. So the challenge here is really how you as a body consider commitments you're making in the future. The point that was made earlier about the fact that the budgets have to be balanced is that you're going to make that balanced choice, and you're going to figure out what revenues you've got as a forecast and what expenditures you want to approve within that balance. And then, as I mentioned, the second question is, to the extent that there's a new entitlement that you're interested in, how is that entitlement financed?
Mr. Chair, if I might, 2 points. First, with regard to the question that you asked, which is the LAO the right entity to make this assessment? This proposal is modeled on how Congress has functioned. I believe it's a CBO in Congress who performs this role. The only other entity in state government which might have the capacity to perform this analysis would be the Department of Finance. But to have that department, which is an executive branch entity, perform that role would really portend a dangerous separation of powers question. And so really among the array of options, the LAO I think is clearly the best and the most closely modeled on the federal approach. The other thing I would say is regarding this proposal, this, as with all the proposals here, as the chair said at the outset, needs to be considered in light of the comprehensive package that's before us. For example, one considers this proposal in the context of the proposal that requires the governor to submit not only a budget for a given year, but the next year and 3 years out. That also should inform our judgment as we embark on the process of determining what we can afford to pay for now and its implications for the long term. Thank you.
I wanted to ask a separate line of question, which is concerning the legislator pay on the budget. It was mentioned, Mr. Kirsten, I think you mentioned it, that we need to have timely budgets, therefore we do this. Is there an inherent assumption with California Forward that legislators will be more motivated by their own salaries than doing the work of the people or the issues that are before them?
Oh, not necessarily. I mean, just the history, the recent history, really long recent history of California budgets has been that they're not improved with time, just a few in the last 20 years, if that. And so what vehicle do you put out there? This was one that we looked at. This is one that there were some questions on. And how you might take it personally, so to speak, and I can understand that. But how do you motivate people to try to say this is a deadline and how important it is for our local governments to have a budget in a timely manner? That is one option that it's available in addressing the salaries and the expenses for the members themselves. We didn't. It wasn't. Believe me. We weren't in an attack mode that, boy, we have to get at the legislature. We just thought that this would be certainly an incentive, an added incentive to have a budget passed on a timely manner, which is so important to not only the state but local governments as well.
Okay, and last, a very technical thing, and then we'll move. Ms. Harkey is next, followed by Mr. Swanson. Last quick question is, why must all the trailer bills be passed by June 25th?
I can do that. There's Fred Silva again. There's been a long-standing problem, both at the executive branch and I would argue the legislative branch, where the package for the budget is done, and there's an agreement about it. And in order to implement that agreement, that there are statutes that need to be passed in order to implement it, so that the governor needs to sign not only the budget but the bills that are appended to it in order to implement appropriations. And there have been times when the legislature simply didn't pass all of the bills sufficient to implement the Budget Act. What that causes a governor to do is to do additional appropriation reductions, additional vetoed items in order to catch up the balance, right, for the bills that he or she was not sent. So we thought that as an administrative device, and frankly as a device for all of you, is to take both the Budget Act itself and all of the bills that implement it and make decisions based on that as a whole rather than separating it into pieces.
Okay. Ms. Harkey, followed by Ms. Swanson. Mr. Swanson.
Okay. I understand that we're trying to get rid of, or that what I'm hearing is that that this would somehow, the PAYGO would somehow eliminate games and phantom revenue. I'm not sure I see that that's really true, because if in fact something is conceivable but ends up not happening, aren't we back in the same boat?
I'm not sure I understand the question myself. I don't know if the panelists do.
Well, let me say what we've seen in budgets past. I've only been up here a year, but what we've seen is suppositions that the revenue is going to come from this place, or that the revenue is going to be higher here, or that we're actually going to get some federal stimulus dollars that end up not being quite as much as we thought they were, if at all. So what would preclude that from happening in your PAYGO plan?
Well, I will actually speak first. One has to rely on the best expertise available. The proposal vests that authority within the Legislative Analyst's Office to do its best predicting and analyzing possible. if someone's going to have to do that, someone's going to have to make a reasoned assessment of what's likely to occur. The LAO is independent. They're vested with that authority. Now, I actually want to say something else about the measure itself, though. You know, I think from a legislator standpoint, maybe the most important element of this is really reflecting seriously, and this is something Ms. McPeak mentioned, on what our priorities are. The PAYGO approach is, for me, as much an expression of priority setting as anything else. It's assessing whether the value of something new supersedes the value of something that already exists or is important enough to require additional revenue. And if you take a new measure, a new proposal for $25 million or more in isolation, it really places much more responsibility on individual legislators, and it also does something else. I think it enables us to crystallize in isolation from everything else what matters most. So for me, that's what counts in this proposal.
Okay, so this body will in fact rely on the LAO. The LAO's word will be the final word as to whether something pays for itself or it doesn't pay for itself. Well, is there any recourse around that? I guess I'm trying to find the wiggle room here.
In the end, it's to you as a legislative body. We're not suggesting that the legislative analyst or the Department of Finance or anyone else stand in the way of appropriate policymaking that you all enter into, because that's what you do as an institution. So what we're suggesting is that the legislative analyst ought to provide information to you as to whether or not a given bill that's covered by this proposal has sufficient resources in it to finance it. And so they do that. You may overcome that by simply saying, we think it's highly important to do this, and therefore we're going to do it. Now, we've had...
So do we, excuse me then, let me stop you there. So then do we have to find additional monies if the LAO says that it's not there? Because nobody listens to the LAO up here, which is what has been really wrong for the last year I've been here. So I'm trying to see what kind of teeth does this really have? Does it just sound good? Does it make us look good, like we're doing good things here by the people of California? Or is there some real constraint here?
The constraint is that if the LAO determines that the measure requires counterbalancing revenue, this is triggered, PAYGO is triggered, and the legislature doesn't attach that revenue or those reductions to the measure is void.
Okay, so if the LAO says, and that's not what I heard over here, but so let me just clarify that. If the LAO says, and I've got the bills here, I'm going to read it in very much detail. I'll probably have some questions one-on-one. But if the LAO states that, you know, this revenue is not likely to be here, and we counterbalance that and say, oh, yes, or somebody counterbalances, oh, yes, we think it will be here, we're going to get it from here, the LAO rules?
No, you can make a finding that overcomes that. Again, we're not suggesting that an administrative agency stand in the way of the legislature.
That's what I wanted to know. It's an escape hatch. I wanted to know that. That's very important for the legitimacy of the PAYGO, in my opinion. That strikes at the heart of the problem that we've had in this body. So if there's an escape hatch, then, you know, I'm a little thinking maybe we're selling something that we're not going to actually get. But let me just review it.
I do want to point out it's a two-thirds vote, by the way, not a majority vote.
Well, we seem to have no problem getting those. Anyway, let me go on to the next thing. Are bond measures covered in this?
No.
No. Okay. So bond measures. So if the legislature puts a bond forward with a two-thirds majority down to the people, it still only needs a 50% and it doesn't need to pay for itself. 50% vote of the people and does not need to pay for itself.
It requires a two-thirds vote of the legislature to put it on the ballot and a majority vote of the people to enact it, correct?
Right, 50% or more. Okay, the next thing I wanted to ask is on the late budget. You know, I understand it's been real popular to punish the legislature, and our rating is very bad politically, and I understand that, you know, to take the salary away, I think that makes this package really appealing to the people. You know, that if you're not doing your work, you shouldn't be paid. That's the simple explanation. My question is, I have sat here in the House for days and sometimes hours and had nothing to even begin to look at till the day of. And so while it says that the measure our analysis kind of says that the measure requires the budget subcommittees to complete their work on the budget by May 1st, which makes sense. That's a firm timeline. And then the measure requires each house to refer the budget and budget implementation bills to a joint committee. But what is the meeting of the joint committee? When is that? Is there a timeline, or can we insert a timeline for the meeting of the joint committee, when they have to start meeting so that we can actually start knowing what's in the budget package?
May 1st. Basically, the houses...
So it's the same thing. Okay. So then on June 20th, if you're not a member of the joint committee, I'm assuming you could get all that information early because it's public, right? Okay. So then on June 20th, we get the package. June 20th, at least somebody gets the package. Who gets the information? The chairs would get the information on June 20th, the full report?
That's up to the House. Well, we did not put that level of detail, certainly, in the Constitution. But the assumption is that when the joint committee finishes, that information is available to all 120 members, and they have basically 5 days to complete their work. That's from the 20th to the 25th, and the deadline for sending a budget to the governor is the 25th.
Okay, well, here's been my, this is just practically speaking the way it works. This is the political side of it. I don't get that many hours to even look at this. And then I'm saying, okay, I can give up my salary. It's not a big deal to me. It really isn't. You know, I mean, I'd be glad to just get the budget done, to work as long as it takes. However, you might have some people up here that have some pressures. And, you know, they're not getting paid, and they're not going to get back, so they cut a bad deal. And then all of a sudden, the people of California, for what, a couple $1,000 are getting sold out. I have a concern with that. I know it sounds good, but I have a concern with the ability to stop bad legislation and take your time out working something that might be good and work better for the people. And I'm not sure that with this time frame, if we could all get the data early and we could all start negotiating early, and I understand this is a political thing, it's a majority-minority party thing, but I'm just saying that you could easily, I mean, if people were under financial stress, of which I am not, but if they were, I could easily see some people calling off because they can't afford to not have their salary because we're up here, what, 4 or 5 days a week. You know, there's very few other jobs that work around this. So I'm just saying for the younger members or the members with family, I'm just concerned that there's going to be a lot of pressure for bad votes just to get it over with in the time frame allowed. Is there any way around this? I'm not for, I mean, putting more benchmarks, I guess, for timing so that all members could review.
Well, you have a number of options. One of them is to have a print rule that requires the joint committee, upon their completion, to put the measures in print prior to the House itself taking it up. That way everybody has the same amount of information at the same time. That's one option.
Okay.
Another option, basically, you have among yourselves, which is to ensure that the work of the joint committee is circulated with all the membership. So there are any number of ways you could do that.
Okay. Mr. Swanson, followed by Ms. Buchanan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I see this proposal as a pretty dramatic shift in the balance of power. And so I want to explore that a little bit with you. First of all, the question I have is, what prevents, by statute and operating procedure, the legislature from enacting a number of these provisions as the way we choose to do business here in Sacramento now, without this being submitted to the voters, but on our own initiative, by statute, change the way we operate? What prevents that from happening?
We could. We could.
Nothing prevents you from doing it.
So there's a reason why it's being proposed to be part of the Constitution, Is it because the legislature is not trusted to do that?
If I might respond, Assemblymember Swanson, I immediately answered nothing prevents you from doing, say, a pay-as-you-go kind of provision. You could do that as a rule. You could do that as a statute. When California Forward went throughout the state and listened to a lot of different organizations and voices to see where was there a majority, potentially majority support for a package of reforms, and some of those do require a change in the Constitution, then we put together the package that would, if you will, give an assurance to the public and a higher level of trust of what we're doing in government, that they could rely on the package of reform. So that's why some of these now are provisions proposed for the Constitution.
So as a legislature, we're being asked to turn over authority that we currently have under the Constitution as representative of the people to this process. Included in that is this provision that we must find revenue for any item that's over $25 million. And so I'm curious as to, in this proposal, there aren't any revenue generating ideas, right? There's nothing in here that says we can approve additional revenue by a simple majority, or we can approve, local communities can approve revenue that they need by a simple majority. There's nothing in this proposal that speaks to the question of revenue. That's correct, right?
In the package of reforms for the budget, yes, you're right. We had advanced another companion that hasn't moved in the legislature.
Okay, so then it's fair to assume that in the current world that we live in the middle of this, historic recession, and the structural budget deficit that we have, these proposals to lock us into finding revenue or reducing expenditures without revenue would result in reducing expenditures. And so I wanted just to look at the provision around the budget, around the proposal around declaring a fiscal emergency and the 45-day provision. Currently, the governor can do that, and the legislature will go into session and vote out what they consider, a solution to the problem. But it seems what's been added in this provision is that if the legislature fails to vote out proposal, that the governor by executive order can reduce or eliminate the unexpended appropriation. And it says that it would be done, the budget discrepancy identified, and not exceeding the amount of the budget discrepancy identified by the governor.
Mr. Swanson, just to be clear, I think you said this, just to be clear, the governor's additional power is triggered if we fail to act.
I understand.
Completely.
But it is fair to conclude then that since the governor made several proposals in the budget cycle, that he would probably be consistent with his proposals. And so if he had proposals to cut human services, proposals to cut school funding, or proposals to do those things, if this provision was executed, then he would have discretion to, without legislative authorization, to cut spending in those areas that he felt made up the difference in the budget shortfall.
No, actually, no, I don't think we're saying the same thing. Under the proposal, if a declaration of fiscal emergency is made by the governor, then we have 45 days
No,
to
I got
address
that
it.
part. Yes, and we don't
It
act.
is only in the absence, and which is currently the rule. The difference is with the consequences of that.
I understand.
If we completely fail to act,
Yes.
and only in that circumstance
Yes.
does the governor have those powers. If we act in a way that the governor rejects, we have acted, and we do not trigger the requirements of this provision
But if we do not act,
at all.
the governor has this authority.
Correct.
It's a new authority.
That's absolutely right.
So it's authority that, and this is the balance of power question that I'm raising, it's an authority that we are then giving to the governor to make these cuts without the legislative committee process and without opportunity for the citizens in the state of California to testify to the value of those cuts. And so it is, like I said, it is a dramatic shift in, I think, a division of power. The other question I wanted to ask you is that if we are in the budget cycle and we're proposing an expenditure in education, and we cannot identify the additional revenue for that at the time because the budget is fungible and we're trying to figure out exactly where that proposal under these changes can only be considered if we identify where we take the money from. Since there's no proposals for additional revenue here, and there's no easier way to generate additional revenue, it still requires a 2/3 vote, even though these cuts require a simple majority to take place. And so I'm trying to get to how do we deal with that? It sort of destroys the dynamic of the legislative process and the give and take of the legislative process and the flexibility of the legislative process to approach it in such a rigid manner, is my opinion. And I'm welcome to have you respond to that.
Actually, I share much of what your concerns are. In our local community, our school district is going through a $5.5 million budget cut right now, identifying the teachers that won't be there anymore. Our mental health program has laid off more than half of the people who work to provide services to those most needy. We no longer have an HIV public health person who goes out and identifies and monitors and tries to do prevention programs. We're experiencing tremendous cuts currently with the current system. So what we're looking at with the pay-as-you-go is one element of a comprehensive set of proposals, is a way of getting at what do people trust in their government. Yeah. People want to know that government will not implement new programs without a way to fund it.
Right.
We also want to know that government won't take away a tax without identifying what's going to happen. It's a two-edged sword, and it's a balancing act. The idea of having a majority vote for the budget as a part of this is a balancer, and one that most people, California Forward consulted, would only accept if there is another series of proposals accompanying it. California Forward's proposals also include some local government regional planning approaches that call local counties and cities and school districts to task and say, you guys got some duplication, you need to work together to make sure you're serving the people better.
Yeah,
so it's a balancing act.
Yeah, let me conclude this way. I think a major flaw of the proposal, very frankly, is that in today's reality, we have cut $80 billion from state spending. So the debate over the last few years, the debate is not whether or not this legislature has the will to cut spending. It has been doing that, and the recession has forced it in many cases. The question for us is, what kind of California are we going to live in? Are we satisfied with a California that used to have a budget of $105 billion, and if that budget is $40 billion? What's the nature of our schools? what kind of state do we have then? So for us to consider a proposal that doesn't realistically also consider revenue and what is happening in the midst of this recession, and to say that we can take half the schools in certain school districts and just shut them down because we don't have enough money, it is unacceptable and it is unrealistic. And so we can have this debate, but I think that it's only half the debate. The process, the procedure, whether or not we are constrained. But what California do we want to live in? Where schools are an investment. There is a return of that. It trains a workforce, and there are benefits to our state. But this doesn't acknowledge that, and that's my problem with it, even though you brought Sonny McPeak, who I like. Thank you very much.
It was a good try, wasn't it?
Thank you, Mr. Swanson. Ms. Buchanan, followed by Mr. Adams.
Thank you. I share my colleagues' frustrations, but have a little bit different perspective because if I could draw an analogy, in our school district, when I was first elected, we had to, our facilities were in such bad condition that in about half our elementary schools, when it rained, we brought in great big sheets of plastic to cover the computers so they wouldn't be damaged. And we brought in 32-gallon trash cans to catch the water. And we tried 3 times to pass a bond. And finally, on the 3rd time, this is when we had the 2/3 requirement, we were successful. And one of the things that we realized that we needed to do was get the confidence of the local voters so they understood that investing in our schools was the right thing to do, that it benefited them, that it benefited the children, the schools, their home values. And it was much easier after that to begin to move forward. And so when I take a look at the California Forward proposal, you know, it's not going to print money, and all of us wish we could do something about revenue, because I think the cuts to education right now are completely unacceptable. We're going to lose a generation of teachers. You know, a child can't go back and repeat 2nd grade 5 years from now. He or she gets one shot at it. And there's no doubt, when you look at what's happening to colleges and universities, we have a major crisis there. But I think we have to restore credibility to our budgeting and financial system if the voters are ever going to trust us with increases in revenue. So I appreciate all the work you've done, and I do believe in pay-go, because I believe budgets are everything. And if you don't manage your money well, you can't sustain program, and that's sort of partly where we are. Not it's because of all the borrowing we've been doing, as well as the severe financial crisis. But I do have a couple of technical questions, and some have been answered. I do want to clarify, because the summary versus the bill, the $25 million does get augmented each year by the Consumer Price Index.
Right.
So because that's only 0.03% of the budget. Seems like a big number, but it's really a relatively small number that we're looking at. And then, you know, the LAO, I guess we could talk about whether that's the right authority or not, but I think if you look at the legislative structure, it's probably the only logical authority to have calculate it. But is there going to be any kind of guidelines at all? I mean, in terms of how you calculate what goes into it, are we going to make sure that if we're looking at a program and it's an ongoing program, that we have ongoing money? Are we going to look at it for ongoing money next year, or are we going to ensure that you have to be able to fund that program 3 years into the future or 5 years into the future if it's a one-time expenditure? I mean, how is the LAO going to approach that?
There are 2 provisions in the statutory piece of this that gives some guidance to the legislative analyst about that, and it is along those lines. Remember that this is a statutory provision, so as you grow through this in years, there may be times when you say, you know, we ought to adjust that, or the legislative analyst may come in and say, we'd like that obligation adjusted. So our assumption is that this is something that develops over time. As I mentioned, there are some rules that are in the current proposal. We didn't want to structure that too tightly for the first year out. So
it seems to me, though, I mean, I'll go back to school district, or actually my private sector business experience. There's always a cost of implementing, and there's an ongoing cost to sustain a program. And if you don't calculate both, you're not getting good numbers, because it may cost you $1 million to implement a new computer system or a new program, and then $100,000 or $200,000 a year thereafter to sustain it. So it seems to me that you've got to know what both those numbers are going in, don't you?
I might suggest, the language of the measure empowers the LAO to determine the time frame within which to take into account both the costs and the offsetting revenues. And the thing about that component being in statute is that as this process evolves and we determine that there are more guidelines that ought to pertain to the LAO's work, we can apply them. This, I don't think that we should consider this to be a static proposal.
Well, but it is, if we're going to put it before the voters as a constitutional amendment, it seems like at a minimum we ought to have them calculating what the ongoing implementation costs, what the implementation costs are, as well as the estimated ongoing costs. I mean, it's just a suggestion. Then my next question is, are we talking about the general fund only, or are we also talking about all the various agencies that are funded with special funds?
Both.
Yeah, the answer is both.
Both. Your entire budget.
Okay.
Our entire budget.
And then my last question has been asked a little bit, but, I understand the need for a June 25th deadline, and I understand at the local level how important it is to have some kind of certainty. If we're notifying teachers March 15th, issuing final notices May 15th, I mean, people need to know what the state budget's going to look like, because you can't make decisions if we don't make decisions. But when the governor doesn't have to give his May revise until May 15th, and you want to have all the trailer bills approved by June 25th in addition to the budget, is there not some leeway where trailer bills could be approved a week after the budget's approved, or, add some kind, and no later than or something? I mean, it seems to me that there ought to be some flexibility there, because there will be, major decisions that are made.
Sure. It's a good point. Again, our framework here was to have the budget and the bills necessary to implement the budget all considered at once.
Yeah.
Otherwise, you don't know what you've done with respect to the budget appropriations, because some of them simply may not work until there's a budget implementation bill. And sometimes those bills lag, and they lag for months.
Well, I don't think they should lag for months, but I just think given the tight time frame, there ought to be some wiggle room in terms of, if the budget's approved no later than a certain date, June 25th, you'd have maybe a week after that or whatever to have the trailer bills, because sometimes that language, like Ms. Harkey, I've only been here a year, but you need some time working it out. And then my last comment deals with the fact that, and I don't know what you do with this, but it deals with the fact that we exclude GO debt payments from the budgeting. And when these initiatives are put on the ballot, and for every $10 billion approved, we have $700 million in expenses for 30 years. I don't know what the right answer is there, but that is a significant part of our budget. I mean, in the 80s, debt service was 2% of our budget. In the 90s, 4%. It's up to 7%. It's going to hit 11% if we do nothing. And it seems to me that ought to be something that, whether it's directly in the California Forward proposal or something the legislature does, we need to really consider, where we're going with that long term, because I don't see how we can continue on that path and expect to be able to continue balancing our budgets.
Thank you, Ms. Buchanan.
Good point.
Mr. Adams, followed by Mr. Berryhill.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, I was wondering if one of the questions that was asked earlier, I never really got a full answer, at least not to my way of thinking, and that was, what concerns, if any, do you have that undue pressure would be placed on members of the legislature who weren't financially independent to pass a budget proposal in order to procure a salary?
Yeah. Well, let me say, I am authoring this measure, these two measures, the constitutional provision and the statutory measure, in the light of something you may have heard me say before, and that is, this was a comprehensive package prepared by a bipartisan organization based on a lot of public input and should hold together as a package. So I am not going to recommend specific major changes from this proposal. Otherwise, it invites everyone to pick and choose their favorite elements and a compromise that our constituents demand of us cannot be had. Every one of the elements in this proposal is not of equal value from my standpoint. I think there is a possibility, be it in the initiative that is circulating now, independent of this, that was a majority vote for the budget initiative, or in this. There are some possibilities for the concern that you raised to come to fruition. I think that they're relatively nominal in the wake of another element of this proposal, which is the majority vote budget. So people, there's responsibility along with authority. With those elements in place, the budget should be done on time. Much of the dynamic that I think the lens through which we view the question on the salary reduction is the current situation that we've been dealing with. None of us have been through a majority vote budget world. I think in that world, we shouldn't reach the stage where this becomes a question. So that I am sufficiently comfortable that that is where we'll end up, that I'm prepared to author this comprehensive package in its totality. I don't want to suggest that there is no legitimacy to that critique.
And I don't think that your intention is to be evasive to that fundamental question, nor do I think that it's necessary to bifurcate this one issue as though it was going to stand alone and independent of any other provision of the proposal. But I think it still is worthy of vetting the question, can undue influence exist sufficient to warrant legitimate concern that the budget is being passed for presumptively all the wrong reasons?
Yeah, and I guess my bottom line, to make it very clear, is with the majority vote budget provision that is contained within this package, I am not concerned about that issue to the point where I would feel it needs to be changed. I think that with that authority should come an on-time budget every year.
Understood. And for the record and for what it's worth, I actually support the idea of a majority vote budget. I wish that the majority had unilateral authority over the entire process. If for no other reason, I think there is a level of accountability that exists independent of 2/3, where I think a disproportionate amount of blame is often placed on a minority party rather than the majority party who makes the principal decisions in it. So I'm keenly aware of that, and I guess my concern is not just with the fact that the majority might be able to do that. I think it's also noteworthy to remember that California passed a budget for almost 50 years on time with a 2/3 requirement, and it did so in no small measure, probably, arguably, but probably because of the ability to cross primary vote. It created a very less partisan environment in the legislature. There was a lot of reasons why that worked and it doesn't work today. The hyper-partisanship has certainly contributed to the problem, I think, and that's unquestioned. But that provision does concern me. Even if a majority budget bill was able to be passed, the possibility of having people hold out for the purposes of trying to garner a better budget bill, I feel very strongly that they shouldn't have a pecuniary consideration at play in their determination about whether or not a bill is sufficiently ready for prime time, as it were.
I understand the concern. As I say, I think on balance it's less of a practical concern, but I understand the concern of the abstract. And I want to say something else. You said something very important, Mr. Adams, and that is there has been, especially in the past 15 years or so, there has been what could be called hyperpartisanship here. And one fundamental component of this package is its attempt to de-escalate the partisanship and try to find a middle ground. You've heard members on both sides of the aisle express concern for completely different ideological reasons about components of this package. I would hope that at the end of the day we would all recognize that the compromise this represents is going to help us try to find that common ground with each other.
One of the other concerns I have with the PAYGO provision, and I was hoping that you could help me understand, is what appears to be the absence of the very limitations that the PAYGO envisions existing in the budget trailer bills and the budget process itself. So unless I'm mistaken, I do want you to just help me clarify this point. Yeah. It's my understanding that those PAYGO provisions would apply to the statutory efforts we may make to initiatives per se, but not necessarily to budget trailer bills or budget bills.
That's correct, and I will certainly, the California Forward panel may wish to expand on this, but the budget process is where we want the discussion of these trade-offs to be. So having that discussion in that setting is, I think, a constructive thing. So rather than take up different funding issues in isolation from the comprehensive package that the budget should represent, having that discussion in that context is a good thing. I don't know if the California Forward people want to elaborate on that or not, but that's my view.
That's right. I mean, you have the ability at the budget debate or at the time of considering a budget to look at the revenues, and will, under this package, have a look forward 5 years, much different from today. That would be an obligation that's on the administration. And in the context of a budget, decide, can you afford, with the revenue forecast, the expenditures that you're supporting. So we were trying to not constrain that existing authority and that opportunity to pass the budget, arguably the most important bill that you take up each year. It's then in between budget times that if you were going to enact something, either a new program or a tax decrease, that you would have to find the ability to pay for it, because it would offset the balanced budget you adopted.
And help me understand in practical form how it is then that the legislature wouldn't find itself in the sort of perverse and incentivized position of withholding statutory programs all year long until it becomes budget time, and then just simply inserting those at that point. If, in fact, and this sort of gets back to Ms. Harkey's earlier point, if, in fact, the LAO's determination about revenue is not necessarily a hard check against the legislature, but something that the legislature can actually agree or disagree with during the budget process, help me how that wouldn't be the case.
Well, because the budget, at the end of the day, has to show that it's balanced, so that if you do that in the context of the budget, and there's a proposal there to escalate cost by X amount, and there's only so much money, you have to figure out what your priorities are.
No, I understand, Mr. Fuhrer. Believe me, and we've been here long enough to know that one of the fundamental flaws of that system is the presumption that revenue will exist that doesn't necessarily. And I think one of the other California Forward folks spoke to that point. How is that going to not be the case again, that somebody can make a presumption that revenue is going to exist that may not, and yet we now have a program in place that requires it?
It's a great question. I think that issue exists in every legislative body in the world. And the question is, can a legislative body live up to its responsibility with the governor? Because it's a team effort, the governor and the legislative bodies would have to agree that that budget balances. If they disagree, there's a veto of some sort and there's a potential override or not. But that give and take is what the process is about. There's no way to fully mitigate the concern that you're raising. The only ultimate way to do it is by having voters hold to account those who enact such budgets. And the thing about this proposal that, as you pointed out, escalates the likelihood that that's going to occur is it's a majority vote budget. So the majority is going to be held accountable if there's a problem with those estimations in ways that is currently diffused across party lines.
And I think that's a reasonable answer, and I appreciate that. And it leads me to my last question, and I'm hoping that you can help me understand why this is not the case. As somebody who does firmly believe that the majority party should be held to account for their budgets, why does this proposal stop short of providing complete authority over the budget, both in terms of revenue and in terms of appropriations?
Yeah, I'll leave that to the California Forward team. My guess is that they would say that in the current political climate, the realistic balance to be brought to the voters reflects a majority vote for the budget, but not for revenue, accompanied with the multiple fiscal disciplinary measures that are embedded here, but perhaps they have other things to say.
That's accurate.
Appreciate your time.
Thank you.
It's interesting. Part of what you were talking about, the PAYGO issue, could also be solved in some ways if you linked up the spending and the budget back the way we used to have it through a Ways and Means model rather than the separate model with appropriations and budgeting. It's just something to...
This may be a bigger committee next year.
something to think about for the future. Mr. Berryhill, followed by Mr. Nielsen.
Okay, yeah, I got to admit, when I first saw PAYGO was going to be discussed, I figured one of my colleagues in this building had figured out a way to tax or fee public restrooms. But having said that, I realize this is a part of the budget process that you guys are attempting to change. I think it's a good thing. I mean, I think there's a lot of merits. I do have some concerns. Number one, who asked the LAO for an analysis? I mean, do they analyze every fiscal bill to see if there's an up or down, or is it asked for by the chair? who?
No, what triggers the legislative analyst's analysis would be whatever fiscal committee has possession of the bill. And so that's a fiscal committee. Now, the budget committee sometimes is the fiscal committee and sometimes it's appropriation. The chairman makes a good point about an earlier time. When it was the same committee, it would be easier to implement, it would seem to me. But as it is, the appropriations committee would have possession of a bill, and if that was a new program or a major expansion of an existing one, over $25 million, and they do an analysis of the cost of the bill, then on its face, one would assume that if it was a new program that cost $100 million, then the request from the committee to the legislative analyst is whether or not it's financed. And is it financed over a longer period of time? And so there is a set of questions that are in the statute that would be asked of the legislative analyst to answer, and it's incumbent upon them to answer the committee.
Okay. This doesn't, it seems like there's a lot of things that are exempted from this idea. I mean, like the bonds, for example, the previous water bond that we just passed. You're looking at a bond that's going to cost roughly $800 million a year or better. Something like that isn't addressed in the PAYGO formulas.
Correct.
Okay. Well, I'm a little concerned with that. But thirdly, to Sandre's point of talking about why can't we just do this? We could. I mean, as they said, we could just do this. I think if it is something that we all eventually come to some kind of a consensus on, I think the reason you've got to lock it in is because you've got different governors going forward in the big picture. In the long-term picture, you may have different majorities. So
you mean there might be a Democratic governor next time? What were you saying?
I don't know who the next one's going to be, but I think that there's some merit to locking it in if it's something that we can really all agree on. But
yeah, and going back to something that Ms. McPeak said earlier, this is not an academic exercise, this discussion we're having now. If we do this right, what happens in this committee and then on the floor of both houses is the predicate to voters voting on this package. And I think what was said earlier is the voters are going to see a constitutional change to create a majority vote for a budget. And that must be done by constitutional change.
Right.
There ought to be a balance in the equation, is what was said earlier, so that there's that majority vote for the budget, but some of these other elements as well. And I think that the combination of constitutional mandate and statutory implementation, which is what this proposal has in it, enables that balance to be struck.
Yeah. My only hesitation with the whole California Forward proposal is not so much in the details as it is in, I think there's other things we could look at. And I know you guys have worked very hard, and I think these discussions need to continue. Unfortunately, they don't give us a lot of time to drill down on these issues as much as we should. I think I mentioned in here before, in my opinion, we ought to focus on budget oversight and focus on regulatory and tax oversight 1 year and not do legislation. We're so busy doing legislation, we have no time for oversight. And that's a little frustrating. Just a comment.
And as you know, part of the Reform Committee's effort is not reflected in what's before us now because there are changes that we agreed to implement unilaterally that don't require the voters to approve them. One of those changes is a diminution in the legislation that we'll be proposing next year by one-third, one-third fewer bills.
That'd be fantastic.
By reducing the bill load by that amount, ideally we create the time necessary to engage in the oversight that all of us believe is so critical, and I appreciate the point.
Yeah, thanks.
And in part, I think that having a 2-year budget cycle to be reviewed every year for the next 2 years would give you a shot at that, so to speak, as your mid-year of a 2-year budget cycle, you'd be able to really review it and concentrate on that budget. I think the 2-year budget cycle is an important element of the package that we've proposed.
We haven't been able to get one that lasted 2 months since I've been here, but we'll keep working on it.
And Mr. Miller, as you know, another element of the package does require the governor to submit not a single year's budget, but a budget for that year, a budget for the next year, and estimates of revenue and expenditures for the next 3 years.
Right.
So every legislature will get actually a 5-year snapshot that's quite broad, but a very specific 2-year snapshot, advancing the ball significantly to where you want to go.
If I might also just add, in terms of the question you asked, Mr. Berryhill, and so did Mr. Swanson, about a lot of this, why couldn't it just be done either by you or by the administration? And certainly an administration that was acting very responsibly would be using these principles and these tools. When I've been asked that question in the past by various legislative committees, I did observe that the policy of California, though, gets set by the legislature and the governor acting together. And you've just said it, for going forward and for signaling to the outside world, do we have our act together in California? Are we going to have fiscal stability? And can we attract employers or keep employers here to generate jobs, attract capital investment? That the fiscal stability is very, very important. And it does invite, we would hope, the kind of dialogue and debate as to what are the outcomes and the priorities for California. I mean, that is actually where the debate should be. In a sense, and I want to just maybe close on this, I personally think we're not giving the taxpayers a very good deal today with what they are paying, because we can't even tell them what the outcomes are. And at the same time, I dare say we aren't investing enough in things that will make us continue to be globally competitive, and that's education and infrastructure. I mean, we've got the worst of both worlds, and the policy gets set by the legislature, not just the administrative branch. That's why we're here before you.
Mr. Gilmore for a quick follow-up, and then Mr. Nielsen.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My statement is more of a comment, if you will, and it's a follow-up of Mr. Swanson, who I have a great deal of respect for. You just mentioned just now, there's not a legislator in this building that wants to cut education. Not one. We want to educate our children. I'm a new legislator as well. I find it extremely disturbing to see that we have, over the course of the years, have just spent ourselves into oblivion here. We're in a worse economic recession, as Mr. Swanson pointed out. And it is going to be imperative of future legislatures to live within our means. We are going to have to prioritize our spending, education being at the top of that heap, public safety. But we're going to have to live within our means. And as you just stated, there is create a climate here in California that we can put people to work, because people that are working are paying taxes. We can educate our children and keep our communities safe. Thank you.
Okay, Mr. Nielsen, followed by Mr. Ruskin. Mr. Vice Chair.
Well, I want to commend all of you, and I, like all of you, have enjoyed working with you over many, many years. And I thank you for promoting the dialogue and the discussion on something like this. And it's very significant. You've put a lot of work into it. I do evaluate it, though, as terms of transparency, yes. In terms of accountability, to a degree. And in terms of fiscal restraint, no. I believe there's a bias built into this for not restraint, but for spending. The exemptions particularly argue to it. Proposition 98, general obligation bonds, restoration of fundings from previous cuts. That's a huge, huge one. It stops the legislature from taking any sustained effort to get budgets under control. Those growth in funding required by state law or federal law, and that particularly gets to be a chase when federal dollars entice us and we have to make the state match, and we argue, gee whiz, we lose more money if we don't. That creates a lot of pressure into itself. And a majority vote in the budget with a two-thirds vote for the taxes, that's interesting, but it creates, by virtue of the majority vote budget, a huge expectation that translates into enormous pressure to secure the revenues. And I really believe that there's some problems with that, those statutory exemptions. The legislature also could simply decide that a fiscal estimate is not required. And then the chair of the Budget Committee or the Appropriations Committee, and by the way, I'm well, David Roberti authored dividing the Finance Committee into the Appropriations Committee and the Budget Committee in the Senate. I think it was for its time okay, but I think we ought to go back the other way now. But the chair does not have to request such analysis, as I understand it. And I guess you answered it very adequately, Assemblyman Fuhrer, about why the bonds are not in it. I think the answer would be the same for all of the others. I mean, this was an amalgam of compromise and such as that, but I think all of that does is it creates a bias. And in effect, I think in terms of the governor's authority, it compromises his current line item veto authority, too. At least I would read it as such. And am I wrong about that?
Yeah.
Okay, how so?
Completely distinct from the line item veto. The powers that we're discussing today are only triggered in the event of a fiscal emergency and pertain to that time frame. The line item veto remains as it is.
So he could take any budget, as he did corrections last year, and cut very substantial dollars out of it without any restraint. Is that correct?
Whatever line item veto powers the governor had before California Forward package took effect are the same powers he would have thereafter.
Well, I'm informed that Ledge Council has indicated that on the deadline, and this is about acting on other statutory bills, okay, that the governor cannot act, but the councils interpret this to mean that the legislature can't send spending bills to the governor, but they can continue to work on any other legislation. But that all it is required is that the bill be deemed by the legislature in statute to be addressing a fiscal emergency. Did I read that provision wrong? That's what the old SB 90 disclaimer, which we in local government have so suffered with over the years. State finds it's not a mandate to the local government. Would that not be another just a finding of the legislature, very capricious? We find that it does address the fiscal emergency, therefore the governor cannot exert his authority?
The statement that the legislature has acted to address the emergency suffices under the California Forward package. That's correct.
But what findings does the legislature compelled to make to support that finding? What evidence does the legislature have to come up with in their statute to affirm that it does
There are no findings under the current rules regarding fiscal emergencies and what we can do, and that remains the case under this proposal. I do want to say, Mr. Nielsen, something, though, that I think goes to the heart of what you're getting at here. If one expects the pay-go provision taken in isolation from everything else to carry the weight of the entire fiscal crisis that we confront today, it will not live up to that, because that's not its point. The point of the pay-go provision is to say, if there is a new program of consequence, you have to show how you're paying for it. And that's all it is. But that's an important element that doesn't currently exist in California law. And I would take gently and respectfully some issue with the notion that somehow this package is tilted toward expenditures. Mm-hmm. If one looks at the pay-go provision, which is new, the restrictions on the uses of one-time revenue, which would be new, the elimination of the possibility of using a fee to supplant revenue that previously had been attributed to a tax, and multiple other provisions of this package, one sees an array of new fiscal disciplines that would be abiding because they'd be constitutionally mandated. Does that leave no flexibility for the legislature? Not at all, because the point of this package is not to constrain the legislature to have no discretion. The point is to have better informed decisions based on real data and hold those decision makers to account at the ballot box. That's what this is about.
I would just revert to the fact that the biggest drivers are exempted, though. COLAs, MOUs, and bonds. That's huge. I thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Jeffries.
I was wondering if I could, I guess a couple questions. I don't know if it's for the author or for the panelists. When California adopted California Forward adopted its proposals, you put those all in writing. Is that correct? I mean, everything was spelled out. When you made the transition from your proposals to legislation, Were any of those proposals amended or changed in any way?
Yes, in fact, some of them were improved. Oh, excuse me. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Jeffries. Yes, in some cases, we think some were improved. But the essence of what we had drafted, in case we were going to go directly to the voters, the main thrust of the language has been retained. But let me give you an example, and I want to check with Fred, of what I think is the improvement, and it was one discussed today as to the process of determining when some measure might cost $25 million or more. There is an example of trying to refine the process between the legislature and the LAO so that there is also, you have the power retained at the legislature to make a finding. It's a refinement in language that I can point to that I think actually has come out of the debate, the opportunity to have this kind of presentation to the legislature and to then hear your questions and be able to reflect on them.
If I could maybe follow up, because I have one more after this. You said some were improved.
That's one.
How would we as a body know what was amended, what was changed, and which ones were not improved in your original vision, so that we could find out if we were actually discussing California Forward's proposals or an amended version that you folks didn't originally adopt? I don't know that I necessarily need an answer today as much as the ability to see the changes that have occurred.
Okay.
And then the second question would be, did you adopt proposals as part of your comprehensive solutions here that were not included in legislation that are not going to come before this body, at least as anticipated?
Yeah. Nothing's jumping out at us right now, but let us try to get back to you with an answer.
Okay,
we'd be happy to do that. And there was title and summary. I mean, we published the original proposals, and I think certainly as I'm sitting here today, what has been now embodied in at least 3 pieces of legislation is, in fact, the package that we had advanced.
Very good.
And it was more of an ongoing discussion and like a concern. Okay, this is the basis of what we want to do, but okay, can this what we're proposing? Can somebody game the system, and how can we prevent that or get some stability and transparency to it so people really know what they're getting? So I think the original concept that we've been developing over these 2 years to present this package has been, well, it hasn't been so much veto or amending it so much. It's just coming out with new ideas when we met on a monthly or quarterly basis. So it hasn't been so much that we've changed from what our original thought was. It's just how do we make it better? If I can be, I don't know if that's very clear, but we just
no, it is,
really,
and I'm not trying to beat you up on the issue. It's just sometimes
understand.
your idea of better may not be viewed as somebody else's idea of better.
Yeah, and I can tell you
my curiosity is the transformation that occurred from your original adopted proposals to what legislation is today, and or some proposals that didn't make it to legislation.
I can assure
the global
you
picture.
There's been some pointed and respectful discussions throughout the 2 years among members of California Forward.
May I comment on this point as well? I'm not a member of the board or the executive group of California Forward, but as the process has unfolded over the past couple of years, when changes have been made, there have been email exchanges out to people who participated in the various workshops and the interactive town hall type sessions, so that we were given ongoing information as the elements were put together and as changes happen.
Okay, we're very shortly we're going to move to public testimony, but if members have some I've been informed a few members have some quick comments. Mr. Swanson.
Yeah, no, very quick, Mr. Chairman. Thank you. Let me just say that I recognize this has been at least 2 years into the making, and a lot of work has taken place during that period of time. I simply wanted to offer food for thought. as we move forward. That we're in a very different time than we were 2 years ago. I mean, we've had, the worst recession since the Great Depression. It's affected the nation's economy, and it certainly has affected California's economy. California has had a series of budgets where we've had to reduce spending in just about every category. And I think that as we go forward, there has to be some realistic consideration of how we address that question of revenue. And if not that question of revenue from where we sit, how do local communities address the question of revenue to be able to decide on their own local priorities, whether they're education, police and fire services, those things that are strangling many communities. And so it's called upon us to do that if this approach is going to be balanced. And that's all I would suggest. Because I do appreciate the brain power that has gone into this. But I really think that at this point, I don't think the argument can be made that we're sitting on a lot of fat in Sacramento. I just don't think that argument, it may have been one point when that was a credible argument, but I don't believe that argument's credible now. And I think that it goes more to priorities. And if you're going to speak to priorities, just as you would in your own family budget, you have to figure out a way to pay for them. And there's some things that are worth paying for, like education. Thank you.
Okay, we're going to have some public testimony. So if I could have members of the public who wish to comment come to the microphone.
And as they do, Mr. Chair, I want to thank the chair and the committee members again very much for a very engaged discussion. Appreciate it a lot.
Thank you. And if you could start by stating your name and affiliation and then your comments.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members. Jean Ross, Executive Director of the California Budget Project. And I want to say at the outset that we strongly support in concept pay-as-you-go rules and think that they can have a constructive impact on helping to force people to confront the difficult trade-offs in budget or inherent in budgeting. But we believe that there is a very big disconnect between the intent of the California Forward proposals and how they would actually work in practice. And I think a lot of the discussion in the committee this afternoon actually gets to some of the points that I'd like to raise. First of all, I think it's important to look at what the California proposal provisions is contained in the two measures before you would not do. They wouldn't stop the rise in prison spending that we've seen over the past 2 decades in California. They wouldn't stop the skyrocketing of bond debt service obligations for California, and they wouldn't require the tax cuts that have been enacted in the dark of night with no public hearings as part of the last, the February 2009 and September 2008 budget deals to be paid for. And that's because of the exemptions that are contained in the measure before you. What these proposals would do is tie your hands in the event of a natural disaster. There is no exclusion for an expenditure that might be required in the event of an epidemic, an earthquake, a flood, or other type of natural disaster. And I think that could be very, very problematic given how often we tend to see those in California. And I think that the way the rules are structured, and particularly the exemption for budget implementation bills, is what this proposal would do would force policy making even more irrevocably into the budget process, into those very jam-packed, very difficult days when budget trailer bills are drafted and put before you oftentimes with no public hearing, and away from the policy committee process where you have the give and take and the opportunity to refine legislation and hopefully come with better outcomes. With respect to the bond debt service exemption, I think that is a very, very big problem. Bond debt service is a 20 to 30-year obligation for the state. I think, if anything, you would want to impose tighter rules and not an exemption on those costs. And I think there's been some discussion before the committee there, and I think that is a very, very big problem for you going forward. So what would we support rather than just naysay? Certainly a level playing field that has a majority vote both on the spending side and the tax side, so you can really put priorities head to head. The congressional model was discussed, and I think it's important to note that the congressional model for pay-as-you-go rules, which I believe only applies on the Senate. I don't think the House actually does have a pay-as-you-go rule, but in the Senate it's done by House rules, and oftentimes there are exemptions made for so-called emergency spending, such as what was done in the wake of Hurricane Katrina and some of the aid there, some of the federal economic aid that's come to the state as part of the recovery package signed into law last year. Also have some brief comments on the two-year budgeting process. It's actually interesting. I think a number of states have moved from two-year to one-year budgeting. I think long-term forecasting is certainly a good thing. But what states across the nation have seen is the changes in the economic cycle, and the fact that business cycles go up and down much more rapidly now than they have in the future have actually pushed states to look at a shorter rather than a longer period. But certainly, again, agree with the intent that those deliberations ought to be informed by a long-term forecasting horizon that looks at out-term costs, both in terms of spending and in terms of revenue losses, in terms of tax proposals. So thank you very much, and I appreciate the time and effort you've put into considering changes to the budget process.
Thank you. By the way, I was going to announce that each person should have approximately 2 minutes. We'll be kind of liberal with that as we were, but we're going to shoot for 2 minutes. And then after 3 minutes, I may ask you to stop and move on. So go ahead.
Okay. Good afternoon. Michelle Peelsticker, California Taxpayers Association. I'll save some time in that I agree with so much of what Ms. Ross said with regard to pay-go provisions in the California Forward proposal. But I want to add to that I think that there's a bias against initiatives that come from the general public as opposed to the legislature. And the bias is this, that any cost must be compensated for by new revenue when you're talking about a general public-based initiative. The legislature gets a $25 million threshold. The voting public does not. And so since most initiatives come with cost, even tax increases can come with cost to administer, the voter-based initiative is put at a disadvantage. And also, there's no time to amend a voter-based initiative after the fiscal estimate so that you can go back and get that title and summary and recirculate. By the time you get the fiscal estimate, it's too late. And so I think this would really put a damper on initiatives that come from the general public. I also think it would put a damper on net tax reductions because it's going to be very difficult, short of raising another tax elsewhere, to find the money to pay for a net tax reduction, such as Proposition 13, for example. I know Proposition 13 is not popular with everyone, but for the majority of voters, Proposition 13 has been a good thing, and these pay-go provisions would make that next to impossible. With regard to the majority vote budget from the previous hearing, I just want to say that we don't support a majority vote budget. Here's why. A majority vote, two-thirds vote budget ensures that the majority party has to talk to the minority party. And this is really the only time of year where the majority party really has to have a conversation with the minority. I think that that's good for policy. I think it's good for the public. It may result in late budgets, but a late budget is not nearly as bad as a bad budget. And so I'd rather have a good budget and have it somewhat late than have a bad budget and have it on time. And for that reason, I think that the no legislative pay when there's a late budget, I think that that's sort of a red herring. I don't think that we should punish legislators for having a late budget because those legislators are doing their jobs and they're trying to come up with something that's going to work for the state. And so for those reasons, I oppose the California Forward proposals.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Jai Sukhprasad with the California School Employees Association. Many of you probably have met with our members today. They were all in droves here. We're all the classified school staff in our public schools who have just been decimated along with the teachers and the administrators. We are in opposition. About the only thing we're supportive of, and we're exploring the possibility of having a majority vote budget. That's the one piece that we are supportive of. But the rest of it, we really associate ourselves with the comments of Assemblyman Swanson. We think you're giving away quite a bit in order to get that piece. As a former staff with the Legislative Analyst Office and a staff to this House, working with Mr. Pete Chaffma, he can tell you well that the Leg Analyst Office, for example, used to do analysis of the cost of these bills. But nowhere back then do you even give the Leg Analyst the power that you have to override them by a two-thirds vote in order to move something forward. It just seems odd for you to now add those kinds of power to that office, let alone the fact that they have been decimated from an office of over 100 down to, I think at best half, even that. I don't know how they will even do these estimates. Plus, if you want to do PAYGO, you have a suspense file now. A lot of these things are processes that you can adopt yourself. Right? If you want to have a $25 million of suspense file where somebody has to make a justification, you can do that. Why go through a constitutional amendment process to address all these kinds of issues? I think whether you want a multi-year process, I think one of the comments that was a little unfair to say that you don't pass a balanced budget. I mean, you do pass a balanced budget. The headache is how do you address when you see revenues drop precipitously? We usually normally have only the May revise, but last year we've got the June revise, and I think we had the July revise also, because you saw revenues dropping and there was just no way to address that in a meaningful way. And so I think to do all of these things, all of a sudden, in order to just get majority vote budget, we think you're giving away way too much, and to give the executive house more power to make cuts without your review, we think that's wrong. And we would invite you, I mean, $18 billion in cuts into our schools. If you go to any school right now, you will see firsthand that to have a PAYGO requirement that will prevent you from making any restoration to these cuts or to do anything that will get us closer to the national average, if not the top 5 again in public school spending as we used to do in this state, we think it's just tying your hands completely. And so for all those reasons, we would oppose this bill. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. Thank you. Sarah Flox from the California Labor Federation. And we are here. We oppose unless amended. There are things in this package that we do think are good policy, the majority vote budget for one. We do also think that the PAYGO requirements on initiatives are good policy. Initiative sponsors should go before the voters and earn the support for their initiative and for the funding mechanisms. I'd just like to echo Jai and Jean Ross on a lot of what they said about the PAYGO requirements, including exempting the budget trailer bills from PAYGO. And we also have a concern about giving this new broad authority to the Legislative Analyst Office to decide what is the cost of these bills. And then having a 2/3 to override. And also what it would happen is that majority vote bills would now basically either have to have a provision where they're cutting other programs or have a 2/3 vote, become a 2/3 vote in order to raise the revenue. And so in the absence of having a majority vote to raise revenue, this is basically just putting a cap on spending, especially when we're talking about programs that have been previously cut. We also do have concerns about the new powers to the governor under a fiscal emergency. It was said that if the legislature takes any action then the governor would not be able to make those cuts. And then, so why is this provision in there? We don't feel that there's really a reason. And then also, we have some concerns about tying the hands of legislators by linking their pay to the passage of a budget. We feel that in that case, legislators are going to be forced to make a deal to avoid having their pay cut rather than waiting and making a good deal, one that benefits the public and their constituents. And for those reasons, we would oppose unless amended. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Mark Hill from Department of Finance. I'd just like to talk a little bit about the mid-year cut authority and PAYGO. The governor has supported some sort of mid-year cut or mid-year authority for quite a number of years. There's been any number of things that he's supported, but the most recent of which was actually enacted in AB 1389 in 2008. That was a trailer bill. The operation of that, however, was linked to the fate of Prop 1A on the ballot, and since that didn't pass, it's not in operation, but the governor still supports those provisions. Those provisions, however, would be become inoperative again under the current California Forward language because the provision that's been talked about before where no mid-year reductions could be made unless the legislature doesn't enact any bill in a Prop 58 session would effectively preclude that from ever happening. So I think in order for those sorts of relatively modest mid-year reduction authorities that were already enacted to be operational, it has to be connected with a trigger that works so that if the legislature fails to completely resolve the current year budget discrepancy, then the governor would have the authority to use that limited mid-year reduction authority to try to make up the difference. There are many practical and legal reasons why the governor can really not do a lot in the mid-year because there are constitutional requirements, there are statutory requirements, there are many, many federal laws, and there's just practical problems of trying to implement current year reductions. So it's not ever going to be a way that a huge problem is going to be dealt with. But you certainly can make a start, and as the governor proposed this year, you can begin to address the budget problem earlier, which means the depth of the reductions, the seriousness of the remedies that you have to propose are lessened because they can be spread out over more time. On the pay-as-you-go provisions, we in finance particularly tend to view the budget as being the ultimate pay-as-you-go tool. And especially if you have a multi-year budget and a multi-year financial plan that lends itself to having things be paid for over time, then you don't need all of this individual exemptions to PAYGO that are in AB 2591 as it's currently drafted. The constitutional provisions in ACA 4 would be pretty much fine as they are. There is, as several other speakers have noted, some problems with particular kinds of long-term commitments that may have out-year costs that even go beyond that 2 to 5 year budget window. I don't have anything particularly to suggest there, but we know there are things like bonds, there are things like bond programs that may take years to ramp up that have very far in the out-year maximum cost. There are some potential things like pension benefits and other things that once granted cannot be changed. And those are the kinds of things that, you know, there needs to be a longer-term financial balancing with. And so you may need to think about, as we go forward, some way of dealing with those. That's what I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm Elizabeth Scholes, the Director of Public Policy for the California Council of Churches Impact. We represent 1.5 million members within the mainstream Protestant denominations, and we have many of the same concerns that have been expressed here, but we have one overriding acceptance, and that is that this is restoring a majority vote on the budget, and within that context, a number of the other concerns that we have are altered. Is that within that context, I think that you will not see the kinds of dealings that have happened before. The only thing we're really sorry is not in this is that the deals that are made to secure votes happen to be a felony, and there's no enforcement mechanism about that. We would prefer to see that rule and that law actually be upheld. As far as the $25 million limit on new programs through citizen initiatives, we're fine with that because we think that that's part of the problem that has gotten us here in the first place is citizens demanding services with no way to pay for them. As far as the other technicalities, we do have, as I said, some concerns. We work very closely with the budget project and do pay attention. But on the whole, we are in support of this measure and do urge you to pass it. Thank you.
Thank you.
My name is Susan Levenberg. I'm a trustee of the Davis Joint Unified School District and also a member of the community organization mentioned by Mayor Pro Tem Don Saylor a little bit earlier called Saving California Communities. We have been following the reform effort for the past year aggressively, informing ourselves about all of the different efforts out there. We have come down in support of California Forward's reform package as being inclusive and bipartisan and the most likely to be successful. So I do speak in support of those of the reform package today. I want to thank you for taking up these proposals and for giving them your really careful consideration. This package is a compromise. It's carefully balanced, and it's going to require all of us to give up a little of what we want in order to get what we really need. So the choice that we will be left with if we do not take this package of reforms is the status quo, and I would really submit that that's not working well for any of us. So I would urge you, please, to own the process of reforming state government so that all of local governments and communities can work better in the future. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Chair, members, Cesar Diaz on behalf of State Building Construction Trades Council. We are in strong support of California Forward's proposal. We believe there are long-lasting reforms that are needed. Clearly, the previous speaker mentioned that the status quo is not working. It's not working for infrastructure investment. It's not working for a lot of special programs, education, health and human services. Has put our leadership role, our state's leadership role at risk. And so something is needed. And this type of reform represents a comprehensive package that everyone gives something here. And so we urge your support of this reform proposal as it moves forward. Thank you.
Thank you. Any additional members of the public for or against? No? Okay, just as sort of final comments, I'm very pleased with the way this hearing went. We had a good discussion, a lot of good issues that came up. This has been the final of 3 hearings really vetting the proposal. The next time we meet, we are going to take up a package of slight tweaks. As much as I would like the package that we take up to have major amendments in it and take out the parts I don't like and maybe bolster the parts I do, that's not what's going to happen for any of us. But if there are small sort of technical tweaks that we think just make sense and the California Forward folks are willing to go with, those are appropriate discussions for this week. But again, don't expect our next session to have a radically different package. It's going to be the same package that we take up, but with minor changes that are agreeable to California Forward and members who suggest them. So with that, Mr. Vice Chair, do you have any final comments? Okay, well then this meeting of the Budget Committee is officially adjourned.